Hello everybody and welcome along to today's webinar by BlueSource. We're joined with our partner Harbour and I'll be giving introductions as to the attendees. Today's webinar is on what is your ransomware remediation plan. We'll go through to some introductions. I'm very pleased to say that we've been joined on the webinar today by two members of the Harbour Solutions team. The first of which is Nick Barron, who is the Harbour Solutions CTO. Now, Nick has actually been in the IT industry, much like myself, for over 20 years, working across telecoms with Viatel, managed services and public cloud names like CenturyLink and Global Crossing and even Softcat. Now, Nick combines his years of experience across a broad set of arenas. Now, this helps customers to resolve both their data management challenges as well as delivering more value from today's stored data. Now, Nick's technical knowledge as well as his solution knowledge in his field is second to none. I can speak personally from working with Nick. So welcome along, Nick, and thank you very much for joining us today.
No worries, thank you for having us.
No worries. Also joined by Mr. James Harris, MD over at Harbour Solutions. James, again, been involved in the enterprise market since 1996. He said, sadly, for 24 years. He has both created organizations as well as lead managed service providers in both sales, general leadership roles, more so across the last 15 years, but in various organizations, and that's across EMEA. Now, his experience is both market-led on the sales side as well as operational, and he's very much known, definitely here at BlueSource, as the go-to guy when it comes to helping organizations with their alternative options surrounding things like backup, disaster recovery, and also how to best navigate these, ensuring that it's the fit that's right for the client. For both a short to long-term future. So, James, lovely as always to have you along at one of our webinars. So, thank you also.
Thanks, Danny. Glad to be here.
Good stuff. Then, lastly, just myself. So, sales director for mid markets over at BlueSource, and much like the other two veterans that you have on this session, I've been in the industry, should I say, for about 20 years. Primarily based. I look after not just the mid-market team for all traditional sales, but very much part of the team really pushing the envelope in terms of new solutions with Harbour, as well as the other BlueSource portfolio. That may be in the form of brand new vendors, some of which many of these webinars are going to build out to, but also making sure that we maintain that stability on our existing. So what does the agenda look like for today? Well, you'll be pleased to know that it's primarily going to be covered off by Nick, not myself. I'm much more a top and tail today. The agenda items that we wanted to flag is what are the concerns to an organization? Primarily, they're kind of more focused at that sort of C-level, CXO. We're kind of compartmentalizing those more into the information side. What those concerns look like, and again, this is based on real world experiences, so taking from clients that we've worked with and then being able to kind of exaggerate a little bit what they look like and give some clarity. Also then around the modernization of the market, there are lots of disturbance, if you like, from various different products, various different vendors, some very, very new in this space, some obviously that are re-diversifying and changing the backup market. We're really then coming on to what is the very sort of headline piece, which is around ransomware. Now, in most cases, it's not actually the prevention that we end up talking about. We talk about how we remediate against that ransomware. Again, it's also then how you can get the best value from backups. Again, it's kind of one of those things, whether it's on physical disks sat in the corner of a room, or whether you're actually using sort of elastic cloud and very, very diverse dark storage. There's lots of different ways to look at backup for different organizations. So again, Nick's going to go into some of those details. So just before we go any further, I just wanted to let you know that this session is going to be recorded today. We will be sharing the recording on social media, and that will be on multi-platform as well as appearing on our website. Now, if you are joined and you hover your cursor over the screen, you'll see at the very, very bottom that there is a little box that says Q&A. I think for the first time in our webinars, we're actually opening it out for anybody on the webinar today to ask any questions. what I'll be doing is towards the end of the presentation, just so that we can maintain the flow from Nick, I'll be covering off any questions that are there. And without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Nick.
Cool. Thank you very much, Danny. That's great. Well, we'll jump straight in and kind of start looking over. And I think one of the things we see in our organisation is we talk to a lot of CIOs, a lot of CTOs across all sorts of different industries and all sorts of different verticals, and a lot of those the challenges that they're having do fall into these sort of four areas. So cloud mobility, hybrid cloud, that's still a key priority for people. I think it's less these days about how do I move entirely into the public cloud and much more about where do I put my workloads, what makes sense to leverage in a public cloud, what do I keep on-prem, how do I manage my environment better. So that's was a one point, security and compliance, and we're kind of going to cover a number of those points in this particular webinar. Obviously, coming on from there is sort of policy automations, outcomes orchestrations. How do I take the sort of human error out the equation? How do I drive a higher degree of automation and orchestration across my environments to then mean that I don't have lapses in some of those policies and securities that can happen because we forget to tick the relevant checkbox as we're going down a list of things to do. And then cost management, well, you can probably just put cost in generally. I don't think I've ever met any IT department that's ever said, you know what, I've got far too much money and I don't know what to do with it. It's along the same lines of, I've got far too many people and I don't know how to use them all. Those challenges never seem to happen in IT. Everyone is always under cost control. If you're using public cloud and moving to consumption services, as a number of our customers are, whether that is, say, more of a public cloud or whether that is more of a things like we're talking about today, backup and disaster recovery as a service type model that are giving you a monthly fee. How do I manage that so that I don't get a kicking from the CFO every time that bill goes over something I wasn't expecting? So from today, we're really talking around obviously the sort of backup element of things, or data protection element, and how can we use that to drive an effective ransomware strategy, and how can we drive some value from those backups, from that backup data, rather than, as some of the people on the call have already heard me describe it before, rather than sort of keeping my data and putting it in a cupboard for a rainy day. Is there something better I can do with it? Can I make it more in line to help drive value for the business? So, there's a bunch of reports out there. Gartner obviously did one back in 2019, just talking about how people are looking at their backup systems. And I think, we've kind of come a bit full circle. A number of years ago, certainly, when I first started, backups were the thing that, someone swapped a tape out every day, hopefully, maybe put it in the boot of their car if you were lucky, or sat it on top of the tape drive. And then, that kind of moved on. And yes, people moved disks and bits and pieces, but backup really it certainly wasn't the star of the show. From that side, people were always looking at, how's my production storage? How can I gain more value there? And really, backups are just something I need to do. But what we're seeing now is actually they're a problem. They cause a challenge from running and running at scale. Backup is a pain. I tend to never end up migrating. So unlike my primary storage, where I might move from one vendor to another, I tend to end up collecting backup vendors for some reason across my estate, thus making it even harder to manage. If I am still using tape, that becomes slow and is cumbersome to manage. It's complicated. You've got to ship things off site. Then if you do need the data, you've got to ship it back. You've got to make sure you've got tape libraries that can go back to whichever version of tape you were using at the point. There's a whole lot of challenges around there. And it's not really an element, I probably shouldn't say this as we recruit a lot of backup people, but it's probably not an element, you come out of university or join IT and think, you know what, I want to do backup. It's not at the sort of front end of what people are looking at doing. So it tends to get pushed down, it tends to get forgotten. And there's a whole lot of challenges that then brings, which we can kind of discuss. So we'll talk a bit about a particular product at the minute, a particular vendor we do a lot of work with. So Rubrik, and we kind of pick them because we think they are really changing how backups are done, and they're enabling and aligning to our strategy around driving value from backup in a way that very few of the other players in the market are. There are a number of organizations out there that do a whole load of different backup technologies, but for us, Rubrik really embodies that move, let's say, to hybrid, so into that sort of cloud space, they're fully API addressable. They have a high degree of automation in their environment. You can use a lot of cloud-like methods to deliver backup services. And then because of what they do with the data, which we'll touch on, you can start to drive some real value from them. So we'll talk a little bit about the product and then kind of come on to the meat, which is the sort of ransomware element at the end. So you guys will mostly be familiar with this sort of approach. You had a whole load of different backup software, backup servers. You had proxies you needed to manage. If you had multiple sites, you need to think about how you were replicating that data across. You've got the catalogs for the databases. If they get corrupted, you've got to go about rebuilding and keeping there. So there was sort of an art in trying to keep that entire backup environment alive, let alone whether it's actually backing anything up. And then once you'd managed to keep it alive, you then had to think about, well, where does all my data sit? And you went to your traditional 3-2-1 different model with various different, as I say, tape copies of tape onto different libraries, and then you need to take those tapes off site and all that sort of bit. So it was quite a complicated way. And I think what Rubrik kind of did is come into this and think, that doesn't seem brilliant. That doesn't seem like a very cloudy way of doing things. Is there something different that we could do? So they kind of took and what they call a web scale approach to this. So they use appliances and a building block approach. So as you need more capacity, you slot another brick in and it builds out. So it becomes very cloud-like in its scalability. Its ability to interact with both on-premise data centers and public cloud then means it can be that bridge between the hybrid sort of environment. And it's really super easy to deploy. And probably the easiest way I can describe is we did a POC with a customer. We went in on the Monday to effectively install the hardware, and then we were going to come back the following week to set the POC up. By the time we'd come back, the customer had actually already just started having a play and had managed to back up half their environment. So, it takes a whole load of that complexity out, both at the infrastructure layer. We're not having to deal with all of those different appliances and media agents and all the other bits and pieces that go across the environment. It's just a brick in Rubrik term. It's a 2U appliance, and we scale that as we need to. And it just builds everything in. And they've kind of taken all the sort of best bits of backup, kind of condensed them into a box and made it, as I say, simple, cloud-like in its ability. And we can then start to move that data around in a super easy way, which again kind of makes it, you can start aligning how your backups are done to how your business wants. So historically, certainly in pre-GDPR days, everyone just kind of went, well, I don't really know what I want to back up, so let's just back everything up and we'll kind of keep everything forever. But with the right to be forgotten, with obviously the need to understand what data you've got, and to be honest, the cost of doing backups, having a much more intelligent level and being able to simply deploy and go, well, okay, these sets of servers, I'll only keep that data for 7 days because they're my database servers, and actually after 7 days, the data's no use to me anyway. My file data, well, I'll keep that for longer, but I won't retain much of it on site. I'll push it out to Amazon Object Storage, to Harbor's data center, to wherever it happens to be, because that's the cheapest way to run it. And I know most people don't access files after X date. So the need to sort of recover them is minimal. So you can start to take a much more intelligent way. And the way Rubrik do that is through their sort of SLAs. You can very quickly sort of just attach different VMs into different SLAs. You can even then create a catch-all SLA, which just says, if you install a VM and you don't tell anyone about it, well, we'll pick it up at the system level and we'll just apply a base policy that says, well, at least just do a couple of daily backups on it, so we've got something. So you're able to very easily run and manage that environment at a sort of base level. So from a Rubrik perspective, they call their operating system Cloud Data Management, hence the sort of Cloud Link. It basically enables you to deliver a much higher degree of efficiency across your backup environment. And their deployment cycles are really very quick. So again, they've taken a very cloud-like approach. They're doing major releases sort of every year and minor releases every quarter. There's a whole load of improvements and new features coming on a seemingly sort of daily basis, certainly a regular basis. So what does that mean for kind of the title of this proposal. How does that help with ransomware? How does that help, right? Because when you hear these stories, you always hear about ransomware going for the backups, or you hear then about an extended retention period because lots of that data on premise was encrypted, and how do I then go about getting that back from tape? So I think one of the challenges is that quite a lot of the organizations that are hit with ransomware had up-to-date endpoint protection. So that was the first bit, and clearly it's critical to make sure you do have up-to-date endpoint protection, but it isn't necessarily going to save anything, or save everything from all these ransomware attacks. So make sure you have it, but don't rely on it. So you need to then come up with a better way of, okay, what if we do get hit? So you need to absolutely make sure you have prevention, but that's not necessarily going to stop you having an attack. So how do I make sure that my backup data is secure, and how quickly can I recover should I need to go back to that backup data? So if we look at the sort of traditional route that we had to do backups, it was fairly complicated and fairly slow. So I'd have to know I was under an attack, and sometimes that isn't going to happen for a number of months. The whole point of these ransomware attacks these days is that they are fairly sophisticated, not fairly, very sophisticated. So they are going in and slowly doing things in the background, and they're typically trying to flush out some of your backups so that it isn't easy for you to recover from it, because they obviously want some money from it at the end of the day. So you've got to work out that you are under attack. Then you've got to work out what's been affected, and then you've got to set about recovering those. And maybe you've got some backup jobs that are still on disk, and they'll be relatively quick to restore, but you're probably going to have to start thinking about pulling your monthlies from tape and all the rest of it. And if you've got a fairly substantial environment, the chances of recovering from tape quickly are pretty minimal. You are looking at days, weeks, and in some environments into months to be able to pull all that data off a tape and get it back into the environment in a usable way. So that presents quite a large challenge, obviously. So is there a better way of doing it? And there's some stats here just to sort of show, I guess, some fairly well-published sources of how long it takes to identify, obviously then to diagnose and then to restore. So you can see there's some fairly substantial delays in that, and a reasonable cost. And we're absolutely not trying to scaremonger here. This is much more about making sure you're prepared and understand what you can do to have a sensible remediation plan in place. So if we look at how Rubrik can help, well, it can do two things. So they have a technology called Radar, and what that uses is good old AI and ML, because everyone has to use AI and ML these days. But effectively, because we're backing all of your data up on a regular basis, we can spot changes quicker than some other things can, because we know what you backed up yesterday and we know what we're backing up today. And we can use anomaly detection basically to work out, is something odd going on in your environment? So at this point, we're able to potentially notify you of potential issues. We're also able to start potentially doing some automation, but effectively one of the key things that Rubrik has, because they have effectively a hybrid storage array, that brick I talked about earlier on, that's able to very quickly or instantaneously mount virtual machines and present them back to your ESX cluster. So if you are under attack, we're able to effectively lop off the production environment and present back those virtual machines very quickly. So in terms of, we can go from understanding and identifying some anomaly of a behavior to presenting back a fresh version from last night or last week's or whatever backup is suitable into the environment very quickly. So we can recover quickly off the back of that. And probably the key bit then is, how do I know my backup data hasn't been encrypted? Now, clearly, if your production environment has had an attack, is encrypted, and you aren't aware of it, then any backup, incremental backups we take from that point are going to be encrypted. There's nothing anyone can do about that. But what we can do is make sure that it is impossible for someone to come in and attack those backups. Now, the traditional way you'd look at doing that is air gapping by using tapes, and you'd send those tapes off to Iron Mountain or wherever you wanted to store them. But that is time consuming, it's expensive, and more importantly, to recover, as we sort of said earlier on, is days, weeks, or even months to get all those tapes back and replay them back in. So is there a better way? Well, Rubrik think there is, and I think we agree with them, which is they make their backups immutable. So basically, once they've written to disk, they can't be changed. And because they're using a hardened appliance as well, it's not commodity x86 hardware running a Windows OS. The way ransomware works clearly is that it tries to get elevated permissions into the environment, and then obviously with those elevated permissions, it can then go through and encrypt, change, and modify that file data. Well, Rubrik isn't sat on a Windows server. There's no permissions that you can get into the actual box and into the file stores that it uses. It has. And even if you could, you can't retrospectively change them. So that data, once written to disk, is written to disk. There's nothing you can do to then go backwards and encrypt it. So that sort of removes the need for this, the concept of pushing to tape, because we can't make any changes. We can then send copies as well. So even if you are concerned, and we would always recommend with having off-site copies as well, because this might be something that isn't anything to do with a ransomware attack. This can just be you have a fire, the usual loss of an office. You can write that data into the public cloud or into our environment, and at that point, you've then got the ability to leverage some of the services that the likes of AWS, Azure, and ourselves do around effectively creating worm drives or using object storage as worms. So again, take that read once and ability and remove the ability to change that data once we push to the public cloud. So not only can we recover your data fairly quickly or very quickly by literally right click and what they call a live mount and present the latest good backup back, we can also ensure that those backups that are stored on disks are not affected by traditional file share vulnerabilities with elevated privileges, so that we can safeguard your backup data so that you're able to very easily go and get it again should you need to. So I think don't just take our word for it. So ASL Airlines in France, so the product I mentioned there, Radar, which is the bit that does ransomware detection. So they've implemented that across their environment, leveraging their backups. And that sort of ties into what we were talking about again at the beginning. Well, if I've got all this backup data, there must be something better I can do with it. So using it to help with ransomware and malware is certainly one point. We also look at things which haven't touched on in this particular one, but we look around things like compliance. How can I use my data, use the indexing and metadata I attach to that to then know what my data is, to know what my files are, so I can start to apply PCI, I can start to apply HIPAA or FINRA or any of these other compliance frameworks. I can start to apply that lens onto my environment and know whether I'm compliant or not. And if in many cases know that I'm not compliant, but at least know what I need to go and do to rectify that situation. So again, trying to drive more value from the data you've got. So stop me rabbiting on, I'll hand back over to Danny just to sort of wrap up and talk about obviously what we collectively can do to help as Blue Source and Harbour.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Nick. I've actually just been taking a look to see if there are any questions. We have one question at the moment, so again, I'll refresh that shortly. I actually think that this question leads quite nicely onto the screen that you can see now. Again, leave them anonymous unless you really want us to sort of cover it off. This question is that we have just recovered from a fairly light ransomware attack. We already know that we have a hole in our estate. We probably are quietly panicking. But what is the Blue Source recommendation for this to proactively address? So, I mean, I can obviously go over what we have here, which is the data assessment. This is kind of one of the free giveaways. So again, I can kind of run through that. But to open up that question and also to Harbour, short of the data assessment here, I mean, is there anything kind of proactive as that sort of like initial standpoint that clients can be doing?
I mean, I think the key is not to panic. I mean, that's always difficult in this situation, but is not to panic. And so the key thing we're trying to hear is we're not trying to peddle fear. It's to understand what you need to understand your environment, and you need to understand what you do and how you then go about doing it, and your current backup posture as well. So as soon as you understand all of that piece of the environment, then you can start to make sensible precautions. So we talked about, you know, regardless of whether you're using, you know, Rubrik or not, you should make sure that your backup data is stored in multiple locations. You should absolutely use least privilege access to all of this. So don't have a super admin or a super user that can kind of wipe everything out, or certainly don't have a super user that has any access to things that may well get malware effectively. So look at how your access controls and governance across your environment, across your user estate is, because that's kind of how these things get in and what they're looking for. So absolutely focus on that. Make sure you've got multiple copies of your backup data. And then, you know, obviously what we would recommend is, you know, look at that backup technology you're using, and is it the right technology? Is there something better out there that will potentially protect you more, maybe even save you some money or drive some additional value?
So I think also what you're saying there is there isn't necessarily that silver bullet when it comes to a tool. Quite a lot of this prevention is also around internal processes, making sure that those practices are followed, ensuring that sort of key individuals, either within an IT team or operations team, that obviously that they are, you know, they're following that to the letter. Is that fair to say as well?
Absolutely. I think, you know, I'd love there to be a sort of a silver bullet or a magic bullet, but I haven't found one. There may be one out there, but certainly not that I'm aware of. It is absolutely a combination of things. It's having the right tools, the right training, the right people, and the right governance across there.
Perfect. At the moment, there are no other questions, so I will carry on. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nick, for going through those slides. The next steps, and what we always like to do at the end of our webinar, is to give an offer out. So anybody that's attended today, and indeed we are going to be opening this out to social media, they have the opportunity to register for a free data assessment. So what is it? Simply put, it's broken down into these 4 areas. Primarily, it's a case of assessing your existing landscape. So when it comes to data, it isn't really just about it's not just about the megs, the gigs, and the terabytes. It's also looking at the application estate. It's looking at the geolocations. It is also a case of taking a look at some of those processes and practices that you have. Then what we will look to do is give you a baseline that says what your existing backup is doing, alongside either, you know, replicated disaster recovery or even low-level high availability, and whether or not it's actually delivering against either your expectations or indeed the expectations around things like a ransomware attack. Then you've got the core discovery. So it's then breaking it out into any sort of false positives you have in terms of the environment. It's looking at those key gaps that you may have, and then the recommendations that kind of sit around those is for potential improvements. I think Nick's already touched on a couple of things there, some really simple things that you can do. And again, what these guys specialize in is taking a look, you know, that sort of 10,000-foot view, and saying, with a few tweaks or a few amendments here, actually you can cover a lot of these things, either relatively cost effectively, or indeed it could well be a product that suits. So that then goes into that recommendation phase. Quite simply put, it will cover all of the appropriate findings that Harbour and BlueSource have had, making that recommendation around whether it's going to be professional services engagement, a product, or even if it's just kind of giving you an idea of those simple sort of salient changes you can make. As with all of these things, there's always going to be a bit of a T's and C's. It is subject to availability. The guys are busy at the moment. We have some space. It will run throughout the month of March to the end of April 2020. There's 1 session per organisation. It will be at our discretion. Again, this will purely be if we've managed to round off all of the resources in that area. I'm just taking a look back now. It looks like there are no further questions. So I'll probably look to wrap this up. So we'll go on to the last slide here, which really just has some contact information. So what can you do and how can you contact us? you can go straight onto our website where you will see hello@bluesource.co.uk. That will go straight through to the teams here, which they can obviously come back to you immediately. Indeed, you can pick up the phone and call straight through on the 6228 number. You can visit our website, again, where you'll see other information, not just based on backup, but all of the other areas and solutions that we offer. And again, you can find us on other platforms like LinkedIn and so forth. So unless, I'll do one more check just to make sure. No, it looks like there's no further questions. So all that remains is for me to thank everybody for attending. Indeed, thank you very much, Nick. James, you didn't have to say too much. I know you were probably itching to get something.
It's been a light day for me, Danny. Thank you. Thank you.
No worries. Again, much more for the sort of Q&A. But guys, we really, really appreciate it. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and have a great day.
Not a problem. Thanks.
Thank you.